So over to Jeremy. Jeremy is the content editor of the Join Enough website and a very active member of the Join Enough enabling group, but he's more broadly an independent writer and campaigner whose focus is on the communication of social and environmental issues to mainstream audiences. He's worked on projects for Oxfam, RSPB, World Wildlife Fund, Tier Fund, and many others. His latest book, Climate Change is Racist, was published earlier this year, and his blog, the Earthbound Report, has twice been named Britain's best green blog. So without further ado, over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Yes, I've spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of months doing talks about my most recent book, Climate Change is Racist, which is very short, very readable, very important, and I would recommend it. But that's not what we're talking about this evening. It's quite nice to be talking about an earlier project and one that is more immediately relevant to Join Enough. And that is this book, The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk over the next half hour or so about what we mean by arrival and why it's necessary. And then I want to move on to the more of the subtitle of the book and look at ideas for this economy that is fully grown. And I'll share a series of ideas for what progress might look like on the other side of economic growth. And then The Economics of Arrival is a secular book, but for me, it's very much written from a Christian perspective as well. And so I'll just do a little bit of, at the end, to set it in more of a Christian context for the benefit of this Green Christian audience. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. That's the plan. So I'm going to go on to my presentation at this point, and we'll see if that works okay. Let's just have a quick look here. Share screen. Okay, that looks like it's working. Good. So I can't remember at this point whether I'd started working on Join Enough before or after The Economics of Arrival came out, but I was certainly working on it around the same time, and they're very much connected. They share an awful lot of common ground. There's a real synergy between the two projects for me. They're both about the same thing, about living well without depending on an endless more that we draw on, and without running an economy based on greed, if you like. So a good place to start to talk about that would be with the idea of economic growth. Economic growth is one of the main ways that we use to measure our progress as a society at the moment. Rising domestic product has been a good thing. At times, it means more jobs, more spending power, more people able to afford the things that they want. And in contexts where people don't have enough, which of course includes billions of people across the global south, that is exactly what they need. But what about when people have enough? What about when they have more than enough? What does growth mean at that point? Context is everything. And I think that growth ought to mean something different today at the top of this mountain than it did at the foot in 1800, if you see what I mean. This is not a new observation, of course. We can go all the way back to people like J.K. Galbraith, a man so gifted in communicating economics that he wrote this very witty and readable book about the Great Depression, if you've ever come across that one, called The Great Crash. Managed to make that entertaining. But in 1956, he was looking around at the emerging consumer society in the United States at the time, and he wondered what was next. What were the priorities for an affluent society, as he saw it? And so he makes this observation about what is the next task after you've solved the basics? What do you move on to? And it would be a failure not to move on from the basics of getting people what they need. And we still haven't resolved those questions. 70 years later, we're still asking how we resolve that question. And economic growth has, in my opinion, in many ways stopped being useful for rich countries such as Britain. We do it because we're kind of locked into it, but there are at least 4 big problems with economic growth past the point of enough. The first of those is that economic growth as it's currently configured has proved very difficult to separate from rising carbon emissions and from materials consumption. So we know that driving cars and flying planes and buying more stuff are all great for the economy, but they're terrible for climate change and for biodiversity. And you don't need me to tell you this, and so I'm not going to talk too much about climate change because I know I'm speaking to the converted on those topics. But suffice to say that climate change is inseparable from the economic model that runs the world. And this week, the New York Times published a special report that looked at how every country in the world is impacted by climate change. And even though we know that it's affecting everybody in some way, we still haven't managed to turn a corner on global emissions as a whole. There are some places that are doing better than others, but globally, emissions are not coming down yet. And why is that? A big part of the reason is that all the things that would bring emissions down fast would also bring the economy down. And we can't bring ourselves to do that. Secondly, growth is very poorly distributed. The economy is structured in a way that makes it much easier for rich people to get richer than for poor people to get less poor. So wealth flows to the top, and that of course creates social divides, and these divisions lead to scapegoating and mistrust and extreme politics and even sort of the erosion of democracy. And the dumbest thing about that is that growth is far less meaningful for people who already have plenty. We had a good demonstration of this earlier this year. You might have heard about it back in January, I think it was. When Elon Musk was told that due to a spike in Tesla stock, he was now officially the world's richest man. And this rise in stock price had added billions to his wealth that morning. Some greater than the GDP, the annual GDP of entire countries was added to his wealth. And all to one man. And then when a staff member came into his office to tell him that he was technically now the richest man in the world, he said, "How strange. Well, back to work." And that's the law of diminishing returns, diminishing marginal returns. If I won £10,000 tomorrow, that could be quite significant for me and for my family. It'd be great, thank you very much. If Elon Musk or Bill Gates won £10,000 tomorrow, they wouldn't even notice. The lower your income, the more meaningful growth is. So an economy that rewards the richest first is completely upside down if you stop and think about it from a moral point of view. Third, economic growth has no sense of quality. What's going on here? Everything gets treated the same. So take a little example. We might have a Windows company that reports significant sales growth where I live here in Luton. And that could be because lots of new houses are being built and therefore there is demand for new windows. Or it could be because there's been a rise in antisocial behavior and someone's going around smashing all the windows. Now that increase in sales is reported as a good thing financially, but it doesn't necessarily represent social progress. And in the book, we talk about this as failure demand, demand that's driven by failures elsewhere in the system. So politically, for example, housing benefit, we have to pay out housing benefit because of a dysfunctional housing market. There's nothing good about having to make up for people unable to afford a home of their own. Or the NHS might spend billions on asthma and other conditions because we failed to tackle air pollution. And this is something we can calculate, this idea of failure demand. And this recent report from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance sets out some figures if you're interested in looking those up later. Real world evidence of how we're caught in this cycle of paying to fix what we continue to break, as they put it. And so when you put all this together, you realize that there's a risk that we'll begin to lose what we already have, that the past gains from growth are being eroded by the damage that growth causes. And in the book, we describe this as being like a man in an orchard, and there are fallen apples all over the ground. And so he bends down to pick them up, and soon he has an armful of free fruit. And he's carrying as much as he can, but there's more to pick up. So he bends down to pick up another apple, but then he drops one. And every time he bends down to pick another one, he drops one that he's already got. And you think, well, you might as well stop at this point. Maybe it's time to enjoy what you already have, rather than risking it for one more and one more and one more. So what if we evolved our view of economic growth a little bit? What if we saw it as a means and not an end? What if we talked about quality rather than quantity? Because then we could focus on what growth has achieved for us already, and then we could make better use of our prosperity. Because through climate change and inequality and failure demand, the drive for more risks eroding the wealth that we already have. Now, I see this process as a maturity and a growing up, if you like, degrowth or post-growth, if you like. It doesn't have to be a bad news story about stopping the world because everything's going wrong. To me, it feels like the natural order of things. Everything grows and then reaches its normal and natural size, and then it stops growing. It's a process of maturing, becomes fully grown. Or to use a journey metaphor, if you prefer, growth has taken us to where we wanted to be. And what are the political priorities now that we have arrived? And that's what we call arrival. So thinking about growth as a journey with a destination allows us to think in all sorts of different ways about inequality and about sustainability. So instead of looking ahead always endlessly to this imagined land of plenty, we can make ourselves at home with what we already have in the place where we find ourselves. And so in the book, we don't see this sort of magical point of arrival where all of a sudden you have enough and all problems are solved. It's not like that. But it's more about the potential for stopping at this point and kind of moving on to new things. There comes a point when there is theoretically enough money, enough resources in circulation that growth no longer has to be the first priority. And you can pivot from that pursuit of quantity to quality, and from accumulation to inclusion. So what would it mean to do that, to make yourself at home with the prosperity that you already have? What kind of thing could we expect from an economy making this kind of transition? And I'm going to run through a series of different ways that I think we could make life better for everybody without needing more economic growth. And one of the first places we could start is with work. Because once you've left school, work is probably going to be the place where you spend the most time. And your work and the quality of your work and whether it's rewarding is going to have a major impact on your happiness and your well-being. So we ought to make sure that work is really working for people and giving them what they need for their lives. One way we could do that is to look at working hours. And there was a survey, it's pre-pandemic, so it might have changed now, but there was a survey a couple of years ago that suggested that 41% of people would prefer to spend less time at work, even though they earned less money. And only 10% of people said they wanted to spend more time at work and earn more money. So people value time more than they value money. Now, our views change over time on this. So there isn't a right or wrong answer to this, and wanting to work more and earn more money doesn't mean that you're a greedy capitalist of some kind. You might be in your 20s, you might be childless and single, you might want to work longer hours and earn more money so you could save up to buy a house, for example. But then 10 years later, you might have your first child, you might want to ease back on your hours to spend more time as a parent. That would be perfectly natural in those sort of seasons of your life. So being able to rebalance work time across the population and across our lives would be a great way to give people more control over their own lives. And that would improve happiness and well-being without necessarily increasing wealth. Giving people more time as well, more free time that is, would free up more time for the things that we value, whether that's relationships or volunteering or fitness, or it might be education or hobbies. And I suspect that if we all had more time, more leisure time, we would see a flourishing of civil society, of volunteering, and of community and cultural enterprise of all kinds, really, if we just had more time for those things. And of course, improving life at work isn't just about time, it's also about power. And so in the book, we discuss workplace democracy and greater flexibility, some of which has been forced on us by the pandemic. And a lot of people will not want to go back to 5 days a week in the office, with the boss telling you what to wear and when to turn up and how long you can take for your lunch. A related idea to this idea of good work is that of employee ownership, which would improve experiences of work, and I think it would also help to reduce inequality. And I've added a picture here from the refurbishment of King's Cross Station. Some of you may have walked through this plaza. I walked through there on the way to Glasgow a few weeks ago. And this refurbishment was carried out by the engineering firm Arup. And they're famous around the world. They have a number of iconic buildings to their name, including the Sydney Opera House, perhaps the most famous of them. And they're employee owned. They're the second largest employee owned firm in the country after John Lewis. And the founder, Ove Arup, built his business around the idea of high quality work that benefited everyone in the organization as an end in itself and not just a means to profit. And inclusive business like this is in stark contrast to the shareholder model of business. And we saw this in the pandemic, where you had supermarket workers, for example, who were expected to put in extra hours to keep the shelves stocked and to keep people fed when they had those long queues outside the supermarket. And all the benefits of their hard work and them putting themselves at risk, it all went to the shareholders of Tesco and Sainsbury's. And they did very well, thank you very much, out of all the other shops being closed. And they didn't need to lift a finger or even leave their mansions to make those gains. But employee ownership means you get a share of your own success and of your own hard work. And so the more of that, the better, really. Ownership doesn't just have to be your workplace as well, because we could look at things like community energy, where people get a stake in a wind farm or in solar panels that generate their electricity. And by being community owned, there's lots of benefits to that. You can run at cost or on a not-for-profit basis, so that everyone gets green energy, which is cheaper, and no profits are being removed from the company to pay dividends. Same goes for things like banking. Mutuals and credit unions are able to offer cheaper loans because there's no pressure to deliver profits for investors. And this is true across lots of different kinds of not-for-profit enterprise. Not-for-profit doesn't mean unprofitable. It's important to point out. It's just that the money isn't being extracted all the time from that business to pay external investors. You can reinvest it, you can share it, or you can use it to keep prices low. And so social enterprise could play a really interesting role in a more equal society. Could we imagine, for example, a healthcare system that runs on a hybrid system like this? It's neither centrally planned by government, nor is it run by competing for-profit companies, but it's maybe co-produced by a network of community enterprises, kind of a healthcare by the people for the people, perhaps. Or you could have transport companies, community-owned bus companies and trains. What about supermarkets? Again, the more of this kind of thing, the better. It gives people a stake in the economy and in the services that they use. And this could be really important in reducing inequality. At the moment, what we have when we try to wrestle with inequality, if we bother at all, it's a political priority for some and not for others, of course. What we do at the moment is lots more goes to the rich, and then we try and claw back some of that and then redistribute it through government services. So we tax it and then we try and spend it back into the population through services and benefits. And so we're constantly redistributing. And effective though that is, redistribution is a form of failure demand, because we'd be much better off fixing the problem rather than endlessly trying to make up for its failings. And through things like community enterprise and employee ownership, we could try and avoid some more of that inequality in the first place. Another thing we could look at to create shared wealth is public affluence. And this is where you create shared resources and public spaces, things like parks and libraries, swimming pools, public transport, high quality streets and squares. This picture shows a children's library in Denmark that my sister and her family, they went to Legoland in Denmark and they sent me more pictures of this library than they did of Legoland because they knew how much I'd appreciate it. We can't provide big private gardens and private swimming pools for everyone. Can't be done. But by providing them collectively, we all get the best of everything. And the Victorians understood this, so it's not a radical notion in Britain. If you look at a school or a railway station built in that era, there's a real sense that ordinary people deserved great architecture and great public spaces and deserved beauty. And so these sorts of public spaces and public facilities, we had a philosophy of this in the past and we've forgotten it. And it doesn't, again, for those who get nervous about these things, it doesn't mean central government control necessarily and big government. My local swimming pool, for example, is operated by Active Luton, which is a community wellbeing trust. So this is another way of being able to share wealth with a wider group of people, and everybody benefits from safe and welcoming streets, from squares and parks and playgrounds. And regardless of your personal wealth, those are there for you and they're yours to enjoy. And I think there's really not any point in becoming a rich country if you're not going to build great children's libraries like this one. I don't know why you'd bother to become wealthy if you're not going to spend it on stuff like this. A related idea that we might want to look at is universal basic services. Now, this is an idea which has grown out of things like, oh, hang on, that one. It's grown out of some of the citizens' income discussion, and some people have preferred to talk about universal basic services rather than a basic income. But it's a fairly simple idea, really. We're quite used to the idea that healthcare and education should be free for everybody at the point of use. But other countries have other things that they add to that list. So Sweden provides childcare, for example, so that parents of young children can go back to the workplace. In Lithuania, they solved the problem of digital exclusion by providing high quality free broadband to everyone in the country. And in Croatia, cities offering free public transport, free bus services, which solves transport poverty and it solves traffic and pollution problems at the same time. Because why wouldn't you use a free bus if it's there? Now, we do this a little bit in this country because, as my dad would tell you, we get a bus pass past a certain age. So we are used to the idea of free transport for some. In London, when I lived there, under 18s could travel for free on the buses. I don't know if that's true anymore. So, there is room for adding more things, more services, more free services to this kind of portfolio of free things that we get already. And again, this doesn't have to mean Soviet-style state provision. If we look at how childcare is organized in Sweden, we have a whole network of cooperating private businesses and not-for-profits all working together to provide that care. So you can still have the dynamic of a marketplace, even within free universal basic services. Again, this is all about creating a shared prosperity rather than private wealth, and a more inclusive society where everyone feels they belong. And finally, there's loads more I could say, including things like the circular economy or participative democracy. But I want to just add in one more thing, and that's that if we don't do all of this sustainably, then there's really no point in doing it at all, because we'll only erode our future wealth anyway. So we have to do all of this with a different mindset, rather than one that is extractive, that's always looking to squeeze more out of people and planet. We need to do it in a way which is regenerative, and that leads to more life. And this is a mindset rather than a set of policies specifically, but it would include things like the circular economy, better forms of agriculture, land restoration and rewilding, and a politics of kindness and of belonging that heals social divisions. And if we look at this sort of chart here of different approaches to the environment, we're used to things that make things slightly less bad, greening things and environmentally friendly things, perhaps. Somewhere in the middle, you have the approach of sustainability, which is basically says, how can we keep this going forever? But you'd have to look around at the world we have today and say, what is it that we want to sustain out of the world that we have now? Do we want to sustain this inequality forever? Do we want to sustain consumerism forever? Haven't we done enough damage already? And I think there's been so much damage done that actually we need to go further than sustainability. We need to restore, and we need to create systems that are regenerative, that are on the side of life. And we need to repair the damage that has been done and find ways of living that won't cause further damage. So it's not going to be enough to be sustainable. We need to move beyond that. Now, I think that's enough of that at this point. We've looked at some problems around economic growth and how it leads to climate breakdown and inequality and the futility of failure demand. And we've looked at some ideas for a grown-up economy. For me, all of this is kingdom business because it's about life and flourishing and about people freed from oppression. But let's be a bit more specific about that and consider a story that Jesus told in the book of Luke. So I'll read this to you. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." And then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself?" This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Now, I wonder if we in the wealthy northern world are not in a somewhat similar position. We have an abundant harvest, but rather than looking at how we can share it with those who don't have enough, we keep building bigger barns. We hoard more of it, and we risk it all slipping away. Sometimes, as in this quote from Donald Trump on the screen there, greed is very shameless. But I think we're all implicated in this economy of more. When we see supermarkets that drive the price of milk below the cost of production, and they expect farmers to deal with it, that is the take, take, take mentality, the extractive mindset that Trump so shamelessly lives by. It's the sweatshop clothing on every street, or it's the rare metals in our smartphones and batteries, dragged from the mud by desperate people in open mines run by warlords in places like the Congo. It's the food on our tables that's produced with industrial scale agricultural systems that deplete topsoil and abuse animals and pollute waterways, and that take from the earth with little thought to the future. Or the lights in our houses and the warmth from our heating and the exhaust from our cars that all take from the atmosphere without asking who owns it and who will pay for what we use. And you could argue that this desire for more goes right back to the Garden of Eden, where that temptation first comes in to grab more fruit than we're entitled to. And that instinct has run all through history. But the alternative to that has also been there, running all through history too, to accept the gift for what it is and trust that it will be enough. In the very next section in that story in Luke, Jesus says this, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. Do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them." In Jesus' phrasing there, the opposite of greed isn't contentment. The opposite of greed is trust. The greedy stir up conflict, but those who trust in the Lord will prosper, says the Proverbs, contrasting and trust. And gather just enough manna for you and your family. There'll be more tomorrow. Trust that God's mercies are new every morning. And so I wonder if this idea of arrival is at heart about trust. Trust that if we share our prosperity, we'll all have enough. Trust that if we have enough, whatever the advertisers tell us. Trust that if we just use the natural energy of the wind and the sun, that will be enough. And trust that if we treat the earth right and aren't greedy, we'll find it to be a place of abundance. And that's enough for me, and I will stop there, and we'll have time for questions.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much for those glimpses of hope for a better future, and for your wise words there about trust and how this relates to a Christian view of our future. We welcome questions. Please put them in the chat function, and Kat will help to bring them to my attention. And she's already put some questions there myself. But I wonder if I could just start, Jeremy, with a personal question. In thinking, in envisaging, if you like, the future of our world, of our economy, how do you balance Christian hope and, if you like, human beings' propensity to mess things up in, when you're thinking about the future?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, because there's the potential for doing the right thing is always there, and the potential, as you say, to make a horrendous mess of things is always there as well. I suppose we know that in the grand scheme of things, there is a plan of some kind, and we don't get to know all of it. And so I think for myself, all I can do is be faithful to what is in front of me, and to think about, well, what policies and ideas can I help to promote now in my own immediate context, in my town and in Britain, and trust that those will play their part in the grand scheme of things. But it can be overwhelming, particularly when you look at things like climate change, which are so big and so hard to turn around. I find it very helpful to have my feet on the ground in an actual place here in Luton and try and make a difference here. and I get to see then that I've made a difference without being overwhelmed by the global scale of it all.
Thank you. And could I just ask one more question before we turn to some questions that the rest of us are putting. When you were thinking about writing the Economic Survival with Katherine Trebeck, were you happy? Did you prefer to write a secular book as opposed to one with a specific Christian kind of vision of these issues? Or was it a question of circumstances? And I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't particularly separate them as such. Obviously, if you write a book which is a Christian book, then only Christians will read it. So I wasn't particularly interested in doing that. But what I wanted to do was write a book which was accessible to everybody and accessible to, you know, academics and policymakers and so on. But hopefully, if you read it as a Christian, you would recognize that there were a lot of principles there that you could that would chime with the kingdom and with Christian thinking. And lots of readers have kind of have found that. And the recent Theos report on inequality quotes the book and says, in its conclusion, it says that a Christian response to inequality might look like this, and then it quotes the book. So they've seen it, and various other people have seen it. So it's attempting to bring these two together. It's always the thing, you know, does something Christian, if it's only for Christians, how are you going to be salt and light in the world? I think it has to reach beyond, and so that's what I was trying to do with this one.
There's a question from Kat here, and then I'll bring in a few more questions from others. Kat says, COVID has borne out your comments, Jeremy, about people wanting less work, possibly better quality work and more time. In the US, they're calling it the Great Resignation, since many workers are deciding not to go back to work or to look for different work. Do you think the mindset of the young really might be changing? Is this a really major thing happening, do you think?
I hope so, because there's lots of research over many years to say that people were never quite happy with the amount of work that they were doing. And that this is cultural, you know, as much as anything else. So even if you had a workplace which was, in theory, allowing you to go home at 5, I saw this for myself when I worked in an office, you'd have people who were there at 6 or 6:30, because if you actually left on time, everyone would think you were a slacker. And so you get this culture of long hours and being seen to be there, and your boss sees that you're there and thinks that you're more committed, even though you've just been on Facebook for the last hour. And I think what people saw once all of that was paused during the pandemic was that it didn't need to be like that. And actually, they got a taste for working in different ways. And I think employers have also seen that everything doesn't grind to a halt if people are treated like grown-ups and allowed to work from home. And so hopefully we will see a bit of a settlement on that one, a bit of a rethink. I certainly think that for young people now, the expectations will be different as well, that you'll come into work expecting a greater degree of autonomy and, you know, not having to ask permission to leave 10 minutes early because you've got to get to the dentist or whatever. We can treat each other more like adults in the working world, and the world won't end. Productivity won't end. We'll still get everything done. So I very much hope that it is a change for the good. Yeah.
There's a question here from Rod. Haven't we historically always relied on entrepreneurs willing to take risks for future rewards for innovation and improvement? And would a rival necessarily be less creative and dynamic?
It's a good point that we do need entrepreneurs to bring new to the table. But it's fair to say that there's any number of examples we could give of good ideas that have been brought to everybody with no particular desire for profit, including the internet, which we're using right now to communicate, which was created and then given away because people believed in it. Also, in a world of arrival, there is still going to be new technologies, new ideas are still going to surface and be pursued. it's not an attempt to stop people from having good ideas and profiting from them. It's more that it's no longer required as the driving force for the economy. And I see this when I go to the shops and you see, going into toy shops to look at things for my kids or for my nieces and nephews recently. And the number of things where you think there's nothing of value in these objects. They're just novelties, and they've been created for the sole purpose of being sold, because no child will ever play with them. They will just sit in a cupboard forever. It's that kind of futility which I think we need to get beyond, where we have to keep making new things and we have to keep selling more stuff because the economy requires it, whether or not we want it, whether or not it's good for us. I very much hope that there will be lots of new technologies and new ideas to look forward to. I'm still waiting for my jetpack. 20 years past the year 2000 now. So I hope that there's still more of that, but that we won't have to have it.
Here's an interesting question from Robert Alexander. Having enough must be a subjective perspective. How do we deal with one person's perspective against another as to what enough consists of? They certainly won't be the same, as our lives are influenced by how we've been brought up.
Yes, that's true. And we don't attempt in the book to draw a hard line where we say, this is enough. And at that point, you can't earn any more. It's not about capping things or controlling things in that kind of a way. And like you say, I don't think that you could put a number to it, because it is going to be subjective and contextual as well. I think it's more about, when you look at it at the social level, there are some clear lines that you can see on both money and on resources. So there are some graphs in the book that show how, I should have put these in the presentation, but I left them out this time. You can see kind of rising GDP, and then you get to a point where rising GDP is also leading to higher well-being, longer and happier lives, greater level of literacy and adult education, things like that. And then it kind of plateaus. And then you have all these countries that have got enormous wealth, but they're really no happier. People aren't more fulfilled, and yet they're much, much richer, and therefore their carbon footprints are enormous. And then you get other countries which have delivered really good lives for their citizens on a much lower income and much lower carbon footprint. And the Happy Planet Index is one place where you can see this worked out. So there is a kind of a natural curve to where you've got all the basics, and from now on you're pursuing luxuries. And again, you wouldn't ever want to say that's enough and sort of put a hard line on it, but you can see how economies go through that curve. You can see the same thing, incidentally, with energy. There reaches a point where societies just basically have enough energy, and you don't need to keep adding more and more. Everyone has access to a certain number of kilowatts per hour if they need them, and it just naturally plateaus, and you can see that all across the world. The same with things like the amount of steel in circulation, because it can be recycled. It kind of goes up, and you see places like China that haven't reached that point yet. Steel consumption is massively rising, but in places like Britain or Germany, we have mature infrastructure, and the amount of steel we use has kind of plateaued. So I think that this arrival actually has kind of a natural curve to it. We'd probably break the metaphor if we tried too hard to say, that's enough and no more.
Rose is asking an interesting question. How do you think your presentation would change if you were to give it to an audience in Nepal or South Sudan?
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up in Madagascar, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. And so I don't see the economics of arrival and its ideas as universally relevant for all in the world. And we do actually have a chapter in the book about what arrival means for countries that don't yet have enough. So this, to me, is a set of ideas for over-consuming countries, of which Britain is one, and there are lots of others. There's probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 countries in the world out of some 200 odd that would be very much over-consuming countries. There are lots, like Madagascar, where growth is absolutely what needs to happen. People need a lot more, both on the individual level in their incomes, but also more infrastructure, more energy, greater access to resources, all sorts of different things. There is still relevance from this book and this set of ideas, though, because what you want to be doing if you're a developing country now is making sure that you don't follow the exact pathway that countries like Britain have done, but that you leapfrog past our worst ideas and do things differently first time around. And we see some places doing that in some very specific ways. So, for example, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania has built really high quality bus transport in its capital city. And it takes the best bus services in the world that have been developed in places like Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America and brought it into an African context so that people will want to use the bus and they won't ever even need to aspire to owning their own cars because they've got the best public transport available. Same with renewable energy. You've got lots of places that are going, there's absolutely no point in us building gas or coal power. Let's just move straight to wind and solar power and not repeat those mistakes. Conversely, you had places in China 20 or 30 years ago where you had a situation where the middle class was emerging fast. You had a traditional cycling culture, and then people started to go, you know what, bikes are old fashioned, bikes are the past, and some cities actually banned bikes. You get a car or you get the bus, but we're not going to clutter our roads with bikes. And then 20 years on from that, they realize what a disastrous idea that is. And you've got places like Holland, very high standard of living, everyone's on bikes. And all of a sudden, those Chinese cities have gone, hang on a second, that was a terrible mistake. We better undo that now. And you're trying to rebuild a cycling culture. So I think the idea that you are going to grow and then you will stop growing and you will mature into this place of enough could be a very, very helpful idea for developing countries, and not to repeat the mistakes that we've made.
And thinking again of the the global context, there's a question from Neil. In the context of economics of arrival, what, if anything, did you see or hear at COP26 that gives you hope?
I haven't thought about that in the context of arrival, I have to say. Although my co-author, Katherine, lives in Glasgow and would have a much better answer to that question, I'm sure. I think one interesting thing about the COP was the widespread adoption of net zero targets. And this sort of somewhat begrudging in some cases, but an acceptance that everyone needs to move towards zero carbon. And that includes developing countries as well as richer countries. And so I think for the last question, this idea of how some countries are going to leapfrog past our mistakes and do the renewable low carbon thing first time round, I think there was quite a lot of opportunity for that came out of the COP. Yeah, I won't go into all the things that were wrong with the COP because I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them already and they're perhaps take us off topic, but yeah.
There's two related questions really about leadership and how to take things forward. Julie asks, or Julie says rather, your ideas seem to cut across the familiar political divides of liberal free market economy versus state socialism, to simplify. But how can we take the debate forward, since in the UK, or at least England, that remains, there's the old political framework, the old battle between left and right. And Stefan says, we long to see this kind of just economy in reality. Community enterprise and employee-owned business is great. In my experience, the trouble is it often lacks leadership to be effective. So how do we actually arrive? Maybe they're less similar than I thought, but any thoughts, Jeremy?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, isn't it? Because things tend to get pigeonholed as this idea belongs to the left or this idea belongs to the right, and therefore I shall have nothing to do with it, depending on which side you kind of ally yourself with. And it's really unhelpful because the world does not divide into two neat categories. And I think some of the most exciting ideas don't belong to any one side. A lot of what I've talked about in the book are ideas that actually have been proposed by either one or both of those political divides at different times. Things like universal basic services or basic income. That was pursued by the Republicans in the States under Nixon. But now it would be considered to be a kind of idea more from the left. So it doesn't really belong to one of those. And then you've got ideas like the commons or employee ownership as well, which don't fit neatly into left or right. They're kind of a third way. Employee ownership was promoted quite heavily by David Cameron's government when he was in coalition. There was that brief moment when they talked about the John Lewis economy, if you remember. There's an idea that came and went without leaving much of a mark. But that was, talked about by the Conservatives. So I'm very interested in those sorts of areas where they're either expressed in a slightly different way, or they just cut across those divides, and hopefully you can build some kind of consensus around them. On the issue of leadership, yes, there are definitely situations where you have idealists that create these sort of non-hierarchical organizations, and everyone hopes that it's going to be some kind of utopia, and then it turns out to be just an absolute basket case of an organization. That definitely does happen. There are really good examples as well, and it doesn't have to be that way. I think one of the things that we talk about in the book is we actually spend quite a lot of time on decision making and participative democracy, and how you come to good decisions without relying on hierarchy and the inevitable inequality that comes out of that. And we look at some examples of companies, but also political processes that build consensus and that include ways of hearing everybody and making sure that everyone is included. So yes, you absolutely need leadership, but that doesn't have to mean one person being in charge and therefore demanding a big salary for it.
A question from John Daniels. You've been talking about people wanting to work less. He says, isn't the decline of work due to robotization, AI, likely to be bad news for many people? Loss of meaning, self-worth, utter dependence on the state for UBS, etc. Aren't there major political risks here too?
Yes, and there's a whole avenue of thought around what to do in a society where people are far less important than they used to be, and so the value of human labor is no longer what it was. Yes, and you're in tricky territory here because, of course, there are people who are developing these technologies entirely for profit, and then they want the government to come in and provide a universal basic income and let the government sort that out, even while they're creating these technologies that will make them very, very rich. And we have to be careful of that. I think there's going to come a point where people need to decide what level of robotization or whatever the term you use actually is useful, and how much of it is for profit and not helpful for society. We know that we can say no to technologies because there have been technologies that we have declined to use in the past, or that we've controlled very carefully, including things like nuclear power and so on. There are drugs that we could use, but that we don't, and we have sort of processes for the NHS to assess whether or not this is going to be something which is widely available or not. We can control technologies. You can't buy guns in this country the way you can in the States. We don't use in the EU, haven't used genetically modified seeds, for example. So there are previous examples of controlling technologies and deciding together whether it's something we want or not. I don't know how and when those kind of decisions would be made and what processes there are for assessing AI. and robots and so on. But that may be something that we need to have a conversation about as a society somehow in the years to come.
And Mark, Dick was also thinking about the whole issue of AI. There's a Reith lecture focusing on that going on this week. And his question is, do you think a shorter working week would affect the need for a refocused education system to best use the greater mental bandwidth time, to best use the greater mental bandwidth and leisure time available? So I guess the question is, would a consequence of the adoption of more AI mean a refocused education system, and is that a practical option?
Well, it's certainly something that people assumed would happen. If you look back in the 1950s, in particular, there was almost an assumption that there would be more and more machines, more and more automation, that people would have nothing to do except sit around and drink cocktails and go on holiday. And that obviously didn't happen. We decided that we wanted more stuff rather than more time. But that option is always there. If you invent a machine that makes your factory 10% more efficient, you could just make the same amount of stuff and give people, 10% more time off. That's the kind of thing that we've always been able to do and may want to do more of. There's not many people who would say no to more time off. And there's actually a growing number of companies that are working 4-day weeks or 4.5 days. There are some entire countries that are considering this. You don't hear much about it, but China gives its government staff a 4.5-day week and encourages them to use Friday afternoons to go to museums or to go to libraries and do other things. I don't know if that's still happening, but that certainly was happening for a little while. There are going to be new settlements and new agreements and new ways of doing things, and the pandemic has only accelerated that. And I think that more free time, a shorter work week, could be really quite revolutionary for an awful lot of people's health and happiness.
We're coming up to the hour, and you've been great, Jeremy, at fielding really a lot of questions very generously. We're not, I'm afraid, going to be able to answer all the questions this evening, but we are keeping this as a record, and it may be that Jeremy can respond to some of these other questions on the Join Enough website or in other ways. There's a question from Kat about whether social care should be nationalised or community owned rather than privatised, and she refers to a particular health care company that's a venture capital fund based offshore, owning a number of care homes in the UK, part owned by the Saudi royal family, part by wealthy US investors. And tax justice campaigners recently showed that care homes were suffering from poor pay for staff, poor care for residents, and there's some fairly disgraceful statistics about the amount of profit and dividend involved. Is there a case for social care being just completely nationalised or community owned?
There's definitely a case for it not being in the hands of private companies, that's for sure. And I think social care or care generally, is kind of the ultimate example of why that extractive mindset is ultimately inhuman. And the idea of pursuing growth and pursuing efficiency is very short-sighted when it's applied to something which is so much about care and relationship. And the idea that a carer who sees 10 people in an hour is being more effective than a carer that sees 3 people in an hour. It's no longer care. You're no longer treating people as people.
Yeah.
Whether it needs to be government controlled or something else, I don't know. Personally, I think there are huge benefits to having more local control and more community control. And I would see more potential in organizations that are not for profit. And there's quite a lot of those in the health and care sector already, rather than central control, which can often end up with a sort of distant government and a one size fits all approach. But, you know, people's politics are different on that one. And I'm open to that conversation. But definitely it has gone too far towards leaving it to the market. And part of arrival would be being free of the drive for profit so that we can have a grown-up conversation about what's actually good for people rather than what's good for the bank accounts.
Great. Well, Jeremy, you've been very, very generous with your time, and thank you so much for all that you've given us today to think about and reflect on. We're very grateful, and thank you for the hour you've spent with us. Thank you also, everyone else, for the range of questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer them all, but as I say, we will record them, and it may be that Jeremy can provide some reflections on them in due course. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, our next talk is on January the 26th, when Paul Ashford is going to be talking about the corporate world, friend, foe, or a reflection of wider society. So thank you all very much for coming along this evening. It's been great to see so many people. And thank you again, Jeremy. Thank you.